Brilliant. I'm Anne Clunes, the British ambassador here in Warsaw, and I just wanted to say a very warm welcome to all our friends from the Oxford Society here in Poland to see you here today for the event this evening. I just wanted to out myself that yesterday I joined the society, as Ola is saying. I said to my husband, I'm going to do this thing tomorrow at the embassy with the Oxbridge Society, and he was at Cambridge, as I was, and said, well, why on earth aren't we members? So we immediately filled in the form online, sent in our 100 zloty for the two of us. It's a cheap, a good value contribution.
I've spent it.
And I'm looking forward to taking part in more events. As is he, in fact. So thank you very much. It's good to have that. Today's panel, which I think is going to be really fascinating, is an opportunity to hear from experts about martial law, and I wondered what I should say about that. Because I realised that I probably am really looking forward to finding out a lot more. I remember, for those who don't know, this is the second time I've been in Poland. I worked here in the embassy in the late 90s. And I think that's probably when my beginning understanding happened about martial law. And I started having more personal connections to people who had been involved in it. And the two stories that I guess sort of sum that up for me. I was a sort of a young diplomat learning Polish, living with a family in Krakow. And I remember one evening they said to me, Anna, you just have to understand our past, you really don't. And we got into the car and we drove around Nowa Huta. Had what is as I say, 25 years later, I can tell you about that evening because we drove around and they pointed, this is the church, this is where we used to gather and sort of make our plans, and this is where the tanks used to stand, and this is where we used to gather, and this is how it was in that very difficult period of Poland's history. As part of learning Polish, I then went and stayed with a different family who lived in Sopot. And their story that they shared with me, they were journalists. I think they were connected to some of the underground reporting and newspapers at the time. And they used to tell me about getting onto trains and hiding. I don't know what they hid. I mean, I'm hoping that I find out more about it, but microfilm and getting pictures out, again, of this period in Polish history. And I guess both of those, those friends gave me some sort of sense of what it had been like to live through that period. So I am very excited to hear more about it. It sort of comes on a day when, I think yesterday, the Foreign Secretary, our new Foreign Secretary in the UK, Liz Truss, stood up and made a speech about network of liberty and, the world and how we should, how precious democracy is. And that also feels like a very good backdrop for this event and this evening. So final thing from me is to say that this is all going out onto social media on Monday. We hope it's going to be such a good event you will want to amplify it, tweet it, share it, and put it out there. Please feel free, can I warmly encourage you to do that so that many others can take advantage of what we're about to hear. So a big thank you to Hubert for helping organise this event, and now I hand over to you.
Should I speak to that mic or just? No,
your mic.
Okay. So good evening, everyone, again. My name is Hubert Czerniawski. I have the privilege to be the president of the University of Oxford and Cambridge Alumni Network in Poland. I will have the pleasure to moderate today's discussion. Thank you very much, Ambassador Clunes, and to the whole embassy team, led by Justyna Krupińska, for hosting us tonight. This is our second event at the embassy this year.
Good.
And I only hope that we'll have many more in 2022. But this is for the future. But tonight we're meeting to discuss a bit about the Polish past. We'll be talking about the 40th anniversary of introduction of martial law and about the cooperation between British authorities and Poles living in the UK at the time. Our discussants today will be Mr. Eugeniusz Smolar, who was the director of BBC Polish section since 1982. We were supposed to have with us Mr. Jan Chodakowski, who was the managing editor of Puls Publishing House. Unfortunately, he couldn't be with us today, but he had prepared a statement, and his friend Jan Czerniawski will present that to us. And last but not least, Mr. Antoni Bohdanowicz, who worked with British Solidarity with Poland campaign during the whole time of martial law. So without further ado, join me in welcoming our discussants. Thank you.
I hope you will not be bored, Ambassador.
So if all of you gentlemen could speak for about 10-15 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A session from the floor. Mr. Smolar, if you could start.
No. Bohdanowicz.
Mr. Bohdanowicz, okay, in this order. Okay.
Yeah, I'm a bit worried about this introduction because, you know, British Solidarity with Poland campaign, the organisation that I represent here, wasn't quite as important as some of you may think. But anyway, I'll try to make it as short and painless as possible. If you remember, you know, to understand British Solidarity campaign, where it came from, you must remember the, you know, the beginning of the last decade of the Cold War and the things that happened. The main things were the papal visit to Poland in 1979, in the summer of '79, which was an earthquake in political terms. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan on the 4th of December 1979, which caused a great many ructions in the West. The Moscow Olympics of July 1980, and then the victory of Ronald Reagan in the US presidential elections on the 4th of November 1980. Now, the sequence of events wrong-footed the Soviet government, the Kremlin, to the extent that when Solidarity burst on the scene and forced the Polish communist government into making concessions known as the 21 demands on the 31st of August, they didn't actually spring the Brezhnev doctrine in the way that a lot of people would have expected them to have done, like they did in Czechoslovakia 12 years earlier. We started organising British Solidarity with Poland campaign in late 1980, when, you know, these rumours of Soviet troop movements started to emerge. But the formal launch of the organisation was to happen on Saturday, the 11th of April, 1981. Now, it was supposed to be launched on a Saturday because we were hoping that on the Sunday, in the Sunday papers, all the papers would write about this wonderful new organisation that had just arrived on the scene. Unfortunately, on Friday, the 10th of April, there were the Brixton riots. And everything that, you know, not only the headlines, but every spare column inch in the Sunday press was devoted to the Brixton riots, and you know, people supplying themselves with new white goods and things, and you know, and not a word was said about BSWPC. But nothing really of significance occurred until we were caught unawares in the early Sunday morning on the morning of 13th of December 1981, when martial law was declared in Poland. Now, there was a complete news blackout in Poland, so the British press was rushing around like, if you pardon the expression, blue as flies, looking for any bit of news, and they all crowded around the Polish government in exile because we organised a press conference, which didn't actually amount to very much because the Polish government in exile wasn't really sure what they should be talking about, what their role was. They couldn't very well be inciting Poland to insurgency. But anyway, so while these press people were rushing around, a man from the BBC, journalist, buttonholed me and said, he started talking, and he said, actually, what you just said is quite interesting. He pulled out his tape recorder. He said, could you just repeat this? But your accent isn't very Polish, is it? So could you repeat what you just said with a Polish accent?
I know what you mean.
This was vintage Drop the Dead Donkey stuff, you know, sort of. So of course I gave him short shrift, and you know, I used the sort of industrial language that I knew from the London Borough of Lewisham, where I worked. Now, if it had been left to the Polish communist in exile alone, we know that it would have ended up with Polish eminent Poles making speeches which my English wife, Janet, would have called boring for Poland, because we know what happens, you know, sort of, they all get up and they all say the same thing. But here enter Mr. Justin again, our Czech ally, who gave me an introduction to the director of the Albert Hall, and who was, this director of the Albert Hall made the hall available to us on the 4th of January 1982 for what was called Rally for Poland. Now this Rally for Poland attracted lots of people. You know, there were lots of eminent politicians, trade union leaders, church hierarchs. There was also Vladimir Bukovsky, a heroic dissident from Russia who was expelled from Russia in 1976. But anyway, and there was a whip round, a hat was passed around, and 11,000 quid at least were collected, which in those days was quite a lot of money. But anyway, so I won't tell you who spoke what, except for one person, Dennis Healy, who was then deputy leader of the Labour Party. And the reason why he's stuck in my mind is because he said, you know, sort of there was talk of imposing sanctions on the Soviet Union and Poland, and he spoke against sanctions. He said that we shouldn't be thinking of sanctions because they never work. And okay, that was his point of view. But then a few months, or not even months, a few weeks later, he was saying that we've got to impose sanctions on South Africa because of apartheid, because that's the only language they understand. So, you know, sort of, so you see that, but there was, you know, there is, you must realise, there is this sort of doublethink in a lot of British minds. I'm sorry, Miss Ambassador, but this is the way it goes. I mean, I remember, you know, sort of a discussion at the same time at Chatham House, you know, the Royal Institute of Strategic Affairs, where this man, Geoffrey Stern, he appeared there, talking about martial law, and he said, well, first of all, you know, sort of Reagan is, you know, sort of talking out of his hat because, you know, he's sort of talking about sanctions, he's just shooting from the hip. And he said that solidarity had gone too far. Well, the question was, well, if they'd gone too far, where did they go too far? And of course, they didn't go too far. It was only that they were trying to force the communist government to stick to the promises that they made, the 21 demands. That's all they were asking. So if they weren't sticking to their contract, where were they going too far? But this was the sort of attitude that you had. And now I'll just say a few words about Sir Bernard, because he was a lovely person. I mean, even though he was a Tory, he was a really nice man. He was the sort of patron saint of good causes. He had, you know, sort of, he was the patron saint of alcoholics, everyone, you know, and you name it, he was there. And but he would get confused about who he was sponsoring, because I had a friend who was in some sort of environmental group, and at their AGM, he turned up and started speaking about the dangers of alcoholism. And it was
That's right for Poland.
it was only halfway through the speech that he realised that there were these raised eyebrows and people were wondering why. And so he quickly changed course. He just checked, I'm sorry, where are we? So anyway, so he was like that. But after the Rally for Poland, we had a big reception at the Polish Half Club, you know, at Exhibition Road, which most of you probably know. And there, one of our friends, I won't mention his name because I don't want to embarrass him. I'll call him Machiavelli because he felt that he was, you know, sort of he was a politician. He was aiming at seizing world power, and he used to try to tell me, look, you must get Sir Bernard to do this, you must get Sir Bernard to do that. And I used to tell him that, look, if we overload the man with requests, he won't do anything because he will just get confused. Well, of course, Machiavelli didn't believe me. He managed to corner Sir Bernard at the Polish Half Club at this reception, gave him a wad of papers, and asked him to deal with this. And about 4 months later, Sir Bernard said, he gave me this wad of papers, and he said, Tony, could you just tell me, does Mr. Machiavelli still want our support to get him out of internment in Poland, or not? Because really, Mr. Machiavelli was asking, he was trying to get Mr. The Speaker of the Polish Senate, what was it, Bohdanowicz. He was trying to get Bohdanowicz out. But Sir Bernard, you know, for him, you know, sort of, well, you know, one Polish name and another, well, you know, we're all the same, aren't we? You know, so you know, so he just, so at our meeting at Eton Place, when I was sitting there, I this wad of papers, and I just passed it to Machiavelli, and I said, look, I see that you're sitting here, but are you still interned, or are you, you know, sort of, are you out on parole? I mean, you tell me, you know, so what am I supposed to do? So, of course, Machiavelli then said, this is terrible, we've got to get rid of this man. This man, Sir Bernard, is irresponsible. He's completely unsuitable. I said, look, he's only there to front the organisation. He's not there to, you know, sort of try to, you know, sort of do to, he doesn't know the first thing about Poland. He'll barely know where we are. So anyway, that was Sir Bernard. Then by 1982, it was evident that there was going to be no Soviet invasion. And then, if you remember, some of you may remember that President François Mitterrand made this speech saying, "Sortir de Yalta," if you can understand my French, and you know, get out of Yalta. And there were all sorts of other, you know, sort of campaigns, and then along came Mr. Gorbachev with his perestroika and glasnost, and I suppose, like Lewis Carroll's Cheshire Cat, Polish news just disappeared from the media. You know, so not even a smile stayed. You know, so it was just, we just disappeared. Now, so it was circa 1987 that Sir Bernard wrote a letter to the Polish Commoners in Exile saying, look, shouldn't we now disband this organisation because nothing's happening? Well, we had a meeting at Eton Place, and I said, look, what he's saying is goodbye. Well, of course, you know, sort of the president of the Polish Commoners in Exile, Mr. Sabat at the time, and the foreign minister, Mr. Saska-Wroński, sort of looked at me pityingly and said, look, what do you know of international affairs? No, he's given us a choice, and it's too early to disband. So, and then they said, well, you know, so I said, well, look, I don't think that we're going to get much mileage out of this anymore. They said, don't worry, we'll handle it, you know. So I said, okay, well, I finished my role's finished here. And it was only that, you know, so my wife, Janet, used to help Sir Bernard, that I knew what happened afterwards. You know, so immediately after they told Sir Bernard that they felt the organisation should keep going. Because a year later, I asked Mr. Sabat, oh, by the way, you know, I knew what happened, but I asked him, oh, by the way, what, what's happening with BSWPC? What's new there? He said, oh no, we decided to disband it a year ago. I said, well, how?
Good.
So, you know, what could I do? I just had to laugh. So that was that, and then just to finish off, after the transformations in what was it, about 1991 or thereabouts, the Polish emigre community, as it was winding up, was producing this huge history of the Polish emigre community from the moment it started in 1939 up to its termination with the free elections in Poland in 1991. And I was asked to write a couple of blurbs on this and that, and one thing on British Solidarity with Poland campaign. Well, I mentioned everything. I sort of wrote a warts and all sort of report because I felt that it would be boring otherwise, and this way it made it sound a bit more interesting than it was. So, I suppose, yeah, I wrote that, and it was censored. You know, so we got rid of one set of censors in Poland, and another set of censors in Polish London appeared to make sure that I didn't say anything that didn't make them, the Polish Company in Exile, look
magnificent.
Yeah, il magnificos. Anyway, so I suppose, you know, so I could go on for a lot longer. I'm sorry, but you know, so I'll let you off the hook.
So now may I ask Mr. Jan Czerniawski on behalf of Mr. Chodakowski.
Right, a different aspect. Polish publishing resistance. This phrase was coined by our Society's old friend and guest, Timothy Carton-Ash. It describes the need discerned by thinking Poles of reclaiming unfettered transfer of the printed word outside the censor's reach. We very much wanted to invite Chodakowski, who performed sterling work in the struggle with communist authorities and the Polish censor's office on Misia Street, Mouse Street appropriately, which then employed 465 staff, just censoring published matter. Even Beermat had to pass the censor. This is not counting 2,300 letter openers and telephone listeners. Now, sadly, Janek has a degenerative eye condition, prevents him from being here. He's authorized me to make a brief presentation in his name. This will allow me to describe matters which his modesty would forbid him to mention himself. I stress he was not the only publisher and distributor of émigré literature at the time. Chodakowski was a second-generation London Pole, unusually enough born in Kuala Lumpur. He qualified as an architect at the Architectural Association School of Architecture in London, but already in the mid-70s was deeply interested in Polish opposition politics. And later, on the early death of its founder, Andrzej Stypułkowski, in the early 80s, he became managing editor of Polonia, an existing well-established émigré publishing house. Already in the 70s, Chodakowski was smuggling books into Poland and underground material out of Poland. Border controls were severe. He utilized the time-honored stratagem of leaving his suitcase of books on the rack of an adjacent compartment as soon as he boarded a train. If discovered, the surprised passengers would deny knowledge with the vehemence of the innocent. Conversely, his contacts with the Polish underground and ability to travel in and out on the UK passport allowed him to take written material to Paris and London. Once, while travelling in the French-registered car of a Polish-born French girlfriend, I can't quite understand this, while visiting opposition figures, they were followed, of course. Their baggage was thoroughly searched at Poland's East German border. His idea that putting all the material for Kultura Paryska in one suitcase rather than spreading it had prevailed. The bags were lined up on a long table and opened in turn. As the official reached the incriminating bag, he was suddenly called away, and on returning, continued by opening the suitcase immediately following the offending one. Chodakowski considers himself, he was very lucky never to have been caught with illegal material. His most important contact in Poland became an underground imprint issuing a journal titled Puls an irregular quarterly, for a good reason, run by a circle of Łódź writers and poets. They had issued several books and 10 of the quarterlies when they invited Janek to be their Western editor. He, of course, had visited Poland during the heady carnival, the period of euphoria after the Gdańsk shipyard strike, when Poland said no in thunder, as Jan's favourite poet, W.H. Auden, would have it. When Jeremy Paxman approached Janek to come to the Lenin shipyard as interpreter, strangely enough, he was denied a visa because of his contacts. So he set up in London. He used his design skills to create house styles for both Polonia and Puls, the two publishing houses he headed throughout the 80s. There's a couple of books over there we'll read later. He used a paperback producer and good quality printers, with one exception which we'll come to. The list of financial supporters in Puls starts with Leduchowski, father of our member Jan, who when approached immediately offered £50, and I did note a fair number of my friends, second generation Poles, among the Puls supporters. However, photos of the Gdańsk shipyard strike smuggled out of Poland were Puls's first major success and its only English language publication. The album, with an introduction and captions by the Cold War warrior Leo Labedz, described in the US as Poland's unguided missile, sold like hot buns, with the Sunday Times supplement publishing a spread of the photos. Amusingly, Janek was approached by a Trotskyist group for copyright, but when they insisted on inserting their own verbiage against the photos, he understandably declined. One wonders what the Trotskyist interpretation of devout Catholics, workers confronting a supposedly Marxist regime might have been. Anyway, this success gave Puls much needed capital, and this would help to develop the publishing house. When martial law was imposed, all of the Puls Polish staff were interned. Only Chodakowski in London was free. He took the decision to walk away from architecture to continue the good work from his Earl's Court studio flat in an area of London which is suitably referred to as the Polish Corridor during the war and many years after, due to the great number of Polish exiled institutions dotted there. He felt compelled to continue the work of his incarcerated colleagues. When asked why he left his chosen profession, he would often say, quoting Auden again, that it was necessary to unfold the folded lie. The first Puls published, now in London, was number 14. He obtained letters of support for Solidarność in that issue from Graham Greene, Arthur Koestler, Ian McEwan, and others. His first authors were Brandis and Janusz Głowacki. And then he went on to publish works by a huge number of people: Barańczak, Bartoszewski, Rita Gombrowicz, Zbigniew Herbert, Herding Rudziński, Hille, Kołakowski, Kisielewski, Orwell, Pilch, Kaczmarski. In fact, Jacek Kaczmarski, he gave a concert, 2 concerts, in Janek's Earl's Court studio flat, including the memorable 5 sonnets on the dying of communism. Jacek Kaczmarski, for the young people, was Poland's bard of the time of martial law. 40 people attending, sitting on rows of packed books fresh from the printers. In fact, the second concert was requested by the BBC, which procured 3 Polish sailors who had jumped ship in the Falklands, especially to attend a concert in an Earl's Court flat. As for Polonia, Jacek's other publishing house, which was conceived as a more academic venture, mention should be made of Władimir Bukowski, Zbigniew Brzezinski, Timothy Garton-Ash, Leopold Tillman, Alexander Watt, many others. Many wartime Polish exiles were a solid source of support: Jerzy Giedroyc, Raczyński, president, wartime ambassador, Ciołkosz, Jan Nowak-Jeziorański, etc. To develop this works, there's some amusing stories. 2 MPs, who remarkably are still in the Commons, this is 40 years on, they sort of grow into the furniture, don't they, there, took him to the Chelsea home, newly bought from Julie Andrews, of an American millionaire. He donated a brand new state-of-the-art IBM golf ball typewriter, which delivered print quality typeface. None of you knows what one of those is, do you? Well, we might. Another technological advance was a Philips handheld terminal with encryption capabilities bought in Ryman's, of all places. Text that was typed in Poland could be transmitted through a public telephone and would emerge in the London flat as hole-punched tape, waking poor old Janek up as it clattered into life at unexpected times. This tape was converted to TypeScript. The method was error-prone. Texts needed much correcting. As he grew the business, he rented a couple of basement rooms in the same property. Half a dozen people worked on correcting, editing, typesetting, proofreading. It's actually quite a useful source of income for some impoverished literary exiles from martial law. I'm not allowed to give the name of one household name who was sacked for being drunk on the job most of the time, unless you ask me nicely. We come to distribution of both Puls and Polonia in Poland. About a quarter of each print run was allocated to be smuggled into Poland and distributed free of charge. Those buying these publications in the West happily accepted a higher price to cover this. A book would go through 5 or 6 pairs of hands a year in Poland, so the 500 or 600 copies of each edition would be read by several thousand people. And of course, photocopying, reprinting was perfectly allowed at that time. Methods of smuggling were many and varied, and they include contacting Polish artists on tour, orchestras, folk music. I remember the Lublin University Choir was a popular organization, and getting the musicians to spread the books among their copious baggage, which was rarely searched due to its volume. The lazy border guard was an unconscious ally. Another method, a friend of Herling-Grudziński in Rome, who had been an editor for Weidenfeld and Nicholson. In fact, I think he spoke Polish, and he'd probably been trained at the American Spy School in California, but that's by the way. He put Janek in touch with a most innocent collaborator, a nun operating a religious gift shop by Bernini's colonnade in the Vatican. She would identify suitable pilgrims among the very many Poles who at that time visited Rome and slip them a few books from under the counter. Great. Now, this is getting less amusing now. Exactly 2 miniatures, I've seen these miniatures of the books, of the journal, or a slim miniaturized book could be fitted into a Tampax box, which customs officials would be unlikely to open. This gave rise to one amusing incident when the octogenarian mother of a friend called on Janek to collect books. Her daughter had not forgotten to explain, and upon receiving the little boxes, the lady claimed, "Jan, you are either a boorish young man, or you did not study biology. Jest pan albo grubianinem, albo nie uczy się pan biologii." Typescripts from Poland, without covering letters, did reach Earl's Court via Canberra, a place in Australia. And remarkably, Quai d'Orsay on envelopes with the Quai d'Orsay crossed out in red felt tip. This is, of course, the French Foreign Ministry also provided books. The British diplomatic post was never used, or maybe Her Excellency could check on that for us. Nor was medical aid for Poland. These bodies, charitable bodies, did not want to compromise their charitable work by smuggling books in. That's it. I finished with a personal connection. The Little Conspirator, a citizen's pocket guide on how to operate under martial law, originally published by Czesław Bielecki's CDN, ciąg dalszy nastąpi, was to be reprinted. Janek found a little old Polish printer nearby, a wartime fighter pilot, Wing Commander Roman Czerniawski, my distant uncle. The man had also been the leading wartime Allied secret agent in France, setting up the first and biggest espionage network called Interallié, Poles and Frenchmen reporting through him to Polish London and then to the Allies, to the British. With true professionalism, Roman did not bat an eyelid while accepting the artwork of the Little Conspirator, but he must have thought that he could well have written it himself. More pertinently, by now, Czerniawski's printing equipment was old and worn, so the quality of output was far from perfect, and this was actually ideal, for if the thing were to fall into police hands, they might well assume it had been printed on backward underground presses in Poland. So that's it. As an individual, not immersed in the politics of the underground, Janek could distill an exceptionally pluralistic publishing program for Puls and for Polonia. He developed distinctive house styles, we'll show you a few books later, for both houses, and by boldly numbering each publication of each imprint, he appealed to the collector's instinct, and I believe over a decade, Chodakowski was able to publish several hundred volumes, which have given him a footnote in Polish history. Thanks, Ian.
And may I ask Mr. Smolar?
It's very difficult for me to follow on the same line because during my stay in the United Kingdom, I had to combine two functions. One was the BBC work. I arrived to Britain from Sweden, where we emigrated. I applied because there was in Paris Cultura, there was an announcement they are looking for broadcasters. So I applied. I passed the test, and I asked my friend Krzysztof Czerniawski from Warsaw, who already had been working there. I said, "Why do you work there?" And he said, "Well, all my life I love to talk, and here they even pay me for that." So I mean, it's good enough. My wife did her PhD in biochemistry, cancer research in Sweden. We moved to Britain. She very quickly found work in Imperial Cancer Research Fund and later in King's College. We were very happy. Our little daughter, who was Polish, became Swedish and now became British again. But she was very successful at school. Everything was fantastic. In 1970, we left Poland in rather dramatic circumstances. We were both in jail with Nina. My brother was in jail. We never thought that we will involve ourselves in the Polish affairs again, frankly speaking. But what did we do just 3 years later? Like the émigré from 19th century, we started to publish something, and it was Annex Quarterly. There are some examples of that there. And it was not by chance, its name was Annex. It was Annex to the censored press in Poland. As different from, let's say, Giedroyć from Paris Cultura, or official London, Polish London, never consider ourselves to be some kind of leaders. Giedroyć, with whom we had very cordial relations, and he actually helped us with the first 4 issues, financially, I mean. We quarreled about it, but he believed, like Herling Grudziński did, that because of the political censorship and oppression, the Polish intelligentsia lost the ability to lead, intellectually, conceptually, and politically. He was, of course, he was wrong, and he was proven wrong, and he very much suffered that he'd been somehow marginalized after 1989, which was pretty obvious to me. Why did it happen? So we published this magazine, studying, working. We took this magazine with us in one suitcase to London, and we continued. It grew out of the very small kind of a venture into the major publishing venture, especially when several years later, Nina, for health reasons, couldn't continue with her research job, and she occupied herself full-time publishing. She developed the book publishing. All right, and we did what you describe about, we published, and one correction. Janek is a bit too kind to himself. The operation was financed by the Americans. And Janek and Polonia Book Fund was financed by the International Literary Fund, financed like Radio Free Europe in the 50s by the CIA, later financed directly by the Congress grant. And Janek was a director, and I got money from him. So some people find it very awkward when I talk about it, but the books appeared with the details about the International Literary Fund, and the fantastic Romanian gentleman called George Minden, who ran it, very cultivé, very aristocratic Romanian. I loved talking to him when he came to London. And without that, Kultura Paryska, other émigré publications in Polish, Czech, Russian, etc., would not survive. And it went like that. They paid for the print costs. The rest was our responsibility. They never asked us, what do we want to publish? They had a full trust. They never censored in any way. They never pressurized us. They never influenced us. And the rest, that allow us to sell about every annex and books were a print run of about 2,000. 1,500 were smuggled back to Poland. 500 were sold in the West. That we never paid ourselves for nothing because we were professionals. I worked for the BBC, Nina worked for the Imperial Cancer Research Fund. We didn't need it. We paid some translators sometimes, our friends around Europe or the world who translated something, Kessler or I don't know, somebody else. But we never paid ourselves. So when Tadeusz Mazowiecki came to London in 1987, he got a passport. We were having dinner and he asked, where is the annex office? I would like to see it. So Nina took him by hand to our first floor and showed him a room full of books, etc. I said, this is it? I said, yes, and there is a lady, Indian lady, who does the packaging, you know, etc. And of course, this was our passion. But because of what happened in June 1976, it totally changed our life. I mean, the workers' protest in Radom and Ursus, and then Workers' Defense Committee Corps appeared on the scene. And that started a 4-year hell, because we were the contact points for the so-called information office of Corps, which was Jacek Kuroń with his wife and one helper, Eva Kulik, who is now head of the Batory Foundation, director of the Batory Foundation. There were 3 of them. But the telephone number, 393964, was known all over Poland. So when somebody was arrested somewhere in Katowice, etc., they called Kuroń. And Kuroń called us. My brother in Paris called us. At the beginning, it was very rather strange. You know, we were afraid for his safety. We were safe in London or in Paris, but what about them? But for reasons, most of the time, secret police allow him to contact. Probably they wanted to know themselves. And so what happened? Every and each of us, when the information came, at the beginning it was just snippets of information. Somebody was arrested, somebody was persecuted, somebody was freed from jail, rearrested, you know, this kind of thing. Later there were the political statements. Later there were, you know, essays, and they were all, no, well, essays, they were sent by messengers. But they were just, they read it over the phone. We had to transcribe it. We called Radio Free Europe, because expensive, telephones were expensive. There were no WhatsApp, there were no internet, there were no faxes at that time. Everything was done by hand. And Radio Free Europe called us back, and we had to read them again. They had to transcribe it, and if the news merit that something was important, it went on the air almost immediately. So why I'm telling you that? Because information became a weapon. And my own BBC, of course, with all rigorous editorial mechanism, used the same information, but never verbatim. We quoted in a dispatch, and of course we tried the communist authorities to react to it, but we couldn't. So whenever we wanted to have another reaction, we called Chris Bobiński, who was a Financial Times correspondent, asked him for interview, and he delivered, you know, let's call it objective version of the events. And so we had to balance it. The BBC, I tried during all these times not to embarrass the BBC. First of all, I would be fired. Secondly, it would be unfair, because I valued the work for the BBC deeply, because BBC was involved in the battle of ideas. And information was a weapon. And information was provided by us, directly from Poland. There were no many foreign correspondents in Warsaw at that time, since 1976. They started to arrive on the scene later on. And they provided the second source, invaluable. But if we didn't have a second source, we went to the journalists of the Times, of the Editorial, of the Guardian, Observer, etc. They published it, and we had a second source. But we had to be sure that it's true. And of course, Corps was awkward. To the British establishment, this couldn't happen. They had in their mind and their blood the experience of Budapest 56 and Czechoslovakia 1968. And also, it is important to mention the 1977 Helsinki Agreement. Of course, the Berlin Wall was standing tall, as always did, but the hysteria of a possibility of a nuclear war somehow receded. And of course, the Brezhnev, in order to have his wonderful treaty and the economic cooperation, agreed to the so-called third basket, when all these wonderful Western liberal rights were enshrined, like freedom of expression, freedom of election, freedom of travel abroad, etc., etc., etc. But everybody, including the Foreign Office, I'm sorry, Madam Ambassador, with whom I started to have more and more contacts in various forms and shapes, were very cynical about it. I mean, look, come on, we sign it, maybe something will come out of it, what's for lunch, boy? You know, and then core became noticeable because of, first of all, personalities, mainly of Jacek Kuroń and Adam Michnik, and then because of the success. In 1977, all workers were freed under pressure from United Kingdom, Germany, but mostly the Americans. President Carter had this wonderful national security advisor called Professor Zbigniew Brzeziński. And Zbig was in constant touch with me. He got the information, and he used it. And they proposed to Gierek, who, as you know, took a lot of loans from the West and was in trouble because Poland couldn't pay them back. He promised assistance if he will go easy on the opposition, called dissidents. And that's what happened. Before Carter arrived on the scene, all workers who were sentenced the year before to sometimes 8 years in prison were freed. Incredible success, never happened in a communist country before. This made impression not on politicians, that came later, but on journalists first, who started to go to Poland. We briefed them, gave them contacts. And also there was this wonderful conference, review conference in Madrid, because they agreed in Helsinki that every 2 years there will be a review conference. So, you know, the underground in Poland, CORE, produced a booklet, which we translated very quickly, sent it to Madrid, and on the Polish delegation is a friend of mine, former foreign minister, Professor Adam Rotfeld. And he told me how it looked from the other side, because he was an official Polish delegation, you know, that we came with this report about human rights violation in Poland, and Rotfeld with another friends were around delegates warning them against those imperialist agents coming from you know, coming from London. That was all fun. But why I'm telling you? Because, of course, John Paul II and his pilgrimage was of immense importance. But the fact that CORE have developed a network of collaborators based on publications, including The Worker, Robotnik, and Robotnik Wybrzeża, Robotnik of the Coast, run by Borusewicz, in a group where you could find names like Wałęsa or Walentynowicz or Gwiazda, played an immense role, because it is not enough to have an urge to protest. Not everybody did, by the way. But you must have a conceptual and organizational structure, and that was delivered by the CORE experience. So when Solidarność came on stream, following the strikes in August, I mean, all the there were plenty of correspondence, but plenty of information came through London directly. What happened minute by minute. Before, I must tell, because I remember that very vividly, was the murder of Father Jerzy Popiełuszko. No, that was during the martial law. Sorry, that later.
Was 85.
Yes, 95. So, when Solidarność came on stream, there was a battle with the TUC, and especially some radical unions. There was a certain gentleman called Scargill. Some of you might know, the leader of the miners' workers, who was a communist, and he didn't want to hear about developing a relationship with the unofficial trade unions. But we managed, with the help of Bohdanowicz, who came from Gdańsk. He was one of the leaders of the strike. And what helped to persuade the leftists was the fact that Bohdan, and he didn't realize how important it was that he said, I'm a member of Polish United Workers' Party. That means Communist Party. We joked, it was never Polish, it was never united, workers were very few, and the party, it was a trade union of those who hold power, that's all. But he said that, and that made an impression on Michael Foot. I brought him to Michael Foot, whom I met later. And here is the thing, why, not only British, but the French, the Italians, the Americans, why solidarity became so popular? Not only because it appeared on the scene in the conditions they didn't have a right to appear under communism and the Soviet umbrella, but also because it was because it was something for everybody. So Michael Foot told me, look, it's fantastic. It's a traditional working class trade union, you know, I love it. But tell me, what the picture of Virgin Mary does on the shipyard gates. Margaret Thatcher, whom I met on a few occasions and we talked, she told me, fantastic national liberation movement, strong anti-communist, but does it have to be a trade union? You know how she was hooked on trade unions. So I'm not going to talk about 1981, but the imposition of martial law changed, of course, everything, and we somehow went back to the modus operandi during the cold days. Information, help, money, smuggling, etc. Boring. I didn't mention that during the cold days, we started to publish in English an information bulletin which was delivered to journalists, diplomats, bureaucrats, universities, individuals who were interested in the events under communism. It started, you know, typed on the IBM typewriter. By the way, we bought about half of them in London, sending them to Poland, smuggling them to Poland. You know.
Big expense.
You know, people called me from the shop that it appeared in Ealing, you know, because they knew I was looking for that. And after imposition of martial law, we couldn't handle, because there was so much information, we couldn't handle it anymore. And so we set up something which was called Information Center for Polish Affairs, set up by the retired members of staff of the BBC Polish section, and they took care of money, distribution, etc. And with Chris Czerniawski, we did the content of that. So it started like that, it ended like that, and you are free to look at it later on. It became the most authoritative source in English of the events in Poland. Now, we had to break through this feeling that nothing can be done. And I can tell you, when you talk to the diplomats and to others, Poland, Holland, Slovakia, Slovenia really didn't matter. If it's under communism, it's Soviet. So to explain to them that Poland is different, and there is a difference between Romania of Ceausescu and Poland under Jaruzelski, even including the martial law, that was important. And in time, you had to develop contact, you had to develop trust. And one of the persons whom I'm sure Ambassador met was Malcolm Rifkind. I met Malcolm Rifkind at the LSE seminar in, I think, 1978. I asked him a question about Poland. His answer was very general. Frankly speaking, he didn't know what to tell. But after that, he approached me, invited me for a drink to a nearby bar, and I had to pub, and I had to call my wife 2 hours later that I'm going to be very late, because he was so interested. He bombarded me with the questions, and it appeared that he's interested because his wife is Jewish Polish, and the Poland features very often around the dinner table, one way or another. So we kept in touch, and it became important in 1984 when Margaret Thatcher decided to send him as a minister in Foreign Office on a mission to Poland. And so he contacted me, asked me what's up. When I started talking to him, he said, I haven't got time, and write me a position paper. I did. I even got paid for it.
Oh.
Independently, very nice, thank you. And I sent the message to the Solidarity Underground in Warsaw. And very quickly the answer came, please ask him whether he would be willing to meet with us. So I asked. He said, I will give you an answer tomorrow. Later, I know that he consulted Prime Minister. And he came back and said, yes, if it can be done discreetly. Because I am going on a mission to persuade Jaruzelski to free the prisoners, to ease up, and he can count on on United Kingdom as economic assistance. Everything was arranged. On the Polish side, the contact point was Janusz Chodakowski. During some luncheon with invited Poles at the embassy, Sir Malcolm, he wasn't Sir at that time, excused himself, disappeared in an unmarked car, changed car once or twice on the way with Onyszkiewicz with him, and he was delivered for the meeting with Zbigniew Bujak, Professor Gieremek, Janusz Onyszkiewicz, and 2 or 3 others. They talked for an hour. He returned to the embassy in the same manner, and they agreed that nothing will be spoken about it for the next 2 days. With the ambassador, whose name escapes me, I have it here, who was dead against it. He was close to a heart attack when he heard about this meeting. So in order not to embarrass the diplomacy, he didn't join Malcolm Rifkin, but he did join him, and they laid flowers together at the grave of Father Popiełuszko. And of course, the foreign correspondents were forewarned by the solidarity, and so there were, correspondence, questions, etc. Well, Jaruzelski was furious. There was planned to be a meeting between Malcolm Rifkin, which was unusual with the Führer, Jaruzelski. So he cancelled the meeting, but actually the meeting with the Minister of Foreign Affairs went pretty well. He returned very happy and asked him, tell me, did you ask Prime Minister? He smiled mischievously. He was really excited, about the whole affair. And it was published later. What was important at the time, that Malcolm Rifkin opened the gate and no serious Western diplomat or politicians could visit Poland and General Jaruzelski without talking to the opposition. Even Genscher, Foreign Minister of Germany, did that, and he traveled to Gdańsk. The official Warsaw was furious. He traveled to Gdańsk to talk to Wałęsa. So it was Britain, it was British diplomacy, and it was Malcolm Rifkin and Margaret Thatcher we can thank for. Okay. I don't have time, so I will tell you about another story, which I don't talk all too often, but I was involved in the preparation of Margaret Thatcher's visit to Poland in November 1988. Maybe it was Rifkin. I never asked. Maybe it was Rifkin, maybe somebody else. I was already head of the Polish section for some time. I had contacts and dealings with the Foreign Office quite often, participated in in-house seminars, discussions, etc., etc. Somebody suggested that I actually prepare Prime Minister for the visit, and Timothy Garton-Ash was another person, but he had to go to America, so he did a few papers, one meeting. So I did write position paper, but more important, I wrote about some kind of, there is a phrase of it, it's psychological portrait of people she's going to meet, mainly of Jaruzelski and Rakowski. Of course, of Wałęsa and others. And I wrote that. I was called to number 10. I spent the weekend in Chequers talking about Poland, etc. She were incredible. I can tell you. Memory. She never said Walesa, she said Wałęsa. She remembered the names just like that. Occasions, she asked about Polish history, she asked about relations with the Soviet Union. What's interesting, she was the only one who asked relations not with the Soviet Union but with the Russians. What is the relation between Poles and the Russians? Do they hate each other? I said no. She asked very perceptive questions, and I knew that this computer is working all the time. And she said, after the second meeting, she said, you are going to Poland. I wasn't in Poland for 18 years. I said, I won't be allowed. Yes, you will be official BBC correspondent, not Polish section, officially BBC correspondent. And so I was. But the Poles refused me a visa. And when she learned about it, she said, and I quote, and this is pretty funny, she asked someone at the office to deliver a message to Polish ambassador, no Gienek, no visit. And later, in the secret documents of the Politburo, which my wife published in Annex, 6 volumes, we found how Jaruzelski, the authorities inform Jaruzelski that the head of the Polish section must be some kind of a personal friend of Prime Minister. I mean, the command of English must have been much worse than mine. Anyhow, I did get a visa for 3 days, just of her visit. And I had to make myself available if I was needed. I can tell you that the discussion with Jaruzelski and later with Rakowski went exactly as planned. She were to be strong, but accommodating. She were to ask Jaruzelski questions concerning his childhood, Siberia, how a Polish, I explained to her that Jaruzelski is more Polish than a communist. And you can actually use this as a key to him. And it actually worked. But to no avail. She was so strong in her views, especially telling off Rakowski, who wanted to intervene in discussion, that later in the same documents of the Politburo, we found that he called Thatcher to his colleague at the Politburo, ta straszna baba, this horrible woman, you know. So Maggie must have been very effective. And it was a very good visit because she did promise assistance, and also she delivered a message based on her conversation with Gorbachev. Brezhnev doctrine is off. You can do whatever you want. You can run with it, General Jaruzelski, or you will be overtaken by history. So I will end going back down the memory lane that in 1965, I was walking with Adam Michnik down Mokotowska Street. We had nothing to do but talk politics, our politics, you know. And he said, do you want to meet Antoni Słonimski, famous Polish poet? I said, yes, of course I want. So we went there. The gentleman opened the door, and he spent his war years in London. And in the conditions of a drab communist Poland, he was wearing a very English, you know, outfit. I mean, he was very old to us. That means he was probably 10 years younger than I am now. But he was old to us, he was very wise, and we knew his verses in and out, especially Adam, who loved his poetry. And Adam involved himself in telling Słonimski about our problems in setting the discussion club at the Warsaw University, that the party doesn't want to allow us, etc., 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 etc. And I saw that the old man was clearly bored to death. And he broke in and said, Adam, you won't achieve anything unless you understand how Poland works. Poland can develop in 2 ways only. And Madam Ambassador, this is a lesson for you. One is a Western one. Someone has a brilliant idea. He puts it on paper, sends it to the board, management board. It gets reviewed, probably some expert review from the outside. The authors are brought for discussion, it gets accepted, money people allocated. After 6 months of implementation of the project has been reviewed, changed, adapted. 6 months later, again the same, etc., etc. So Słonimski looked at us and said, that will never work in Poland. What Poland needs is a small miracle. That was 65, and we must agree that we had a wonderful miracles. Of Solidarity, of Workers' Defense Committee Corps, of Pope, of course. I'm sorry the miracle have ended in 2015. Thank you.
Yes. Fantastic.